Ladies and gentlemen, prepare your butts because we're going to be discussing the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One hardware performance. Now, I know typically fanboys really get off on wars on this stuff, but it is worthy of discussion because this is from the gameplay designer over at DICE. His name is Kertz, and he's weighed in to this discussion and has given his thoughts and opinions on the systems at the moment. For example, DX12 on the Xbox One, what it's going to do for it, comparisons for the previous generation, and much more besides. So it's actually quite interesting, and he does make a couple of good points, specifically that really it's kind of the exclusives and the price that's really going to make the difference here. So he first of all mentions that no amount of consumer trust can change the fact that inferior horse in the horsepower category. Now, what he's mentioning there, of course, is comments Phil Spencer made that consumer trust, when they lost consumer trust, that's what really damaged the, I guess you could say, the name of the Xbox. Now, I kind of agree with Phil, and I actually agree with Phil more than what I do with Alan. In my opinion, I think that the hardware performance between the two systems is important, but I think if the negative press that happened for the Xbox One instead happened to the PlayStation 4, for example, the always online DRM issues, then I think that the Xbox One probably would have sold better and maybe the PlayStation 4 would sell worse. But he does go on to clarify to say that the Xbox One will be behind this generation because it just isn't as powerful. He says that when you compare it to the previous generation, the PS3 was more difficult to get the power out of in comparison to the Xbox 360, but it wasn't significantly less powerful, it just took more investment. Now, if you're not too familiar, primarily he's referring to the PlayStation 3's cell processor. The PS3's cell was an absolute nightmare, it honestly was, and it was one of the reasons why a lot of games on the PS3 performed considerably poorer than the Xbox 360's. In my opinion, with the Xbox 360, Microsoft did pretty much everything they should have. There were a couple of hiccups, for example with the RROD we all know about, and they initially were going to go with 256 megabytes of RAM rather than 512. And one can argue that both systems, the PS3 and the 360, were somewhat RAM-starved. 1 gigabyte would have been quite nice, but aside from all of those issues, the Xbox 360 was actually really easy to use. It had a very powerful GPU. It was great access to memory. It was unified memory. The CPU was quite intuitive, but compared to that with the PlayStation 3, the PS3's CPU was an absolute beast. It was a monster in terms of the raw floating point performance. It just was not easy to use. Plus, of course, you had that memory segregation. Then, what about DirectX 12? He says, I don't think so, and this is in reference to, can DirectX 12 make the Xbox One perform as well as the PlayStation 4? It's just not going to be able to reduce the overhead enough to make up for the margin in comparison to the PlayStation 4. He did go on to say that the PC currently is the gold standard when someone else asks them, and devs will make the game to match the least powerful system, so in the end, who cares? He then responds, it's not really that simple. If you can push more on another system for the same development cost, you will, and PC is the gold standard still. You see, I believe what he's referring to here is, at the end of the day, if you're going to be able to push the resolution up higher on another console, which isn't too difficult to do, to be honest with you, you're just simply altering a couple of configuration files before you compile the game. Admittedly, I'm slightly oversimplifying it, but still. Or changing the level of detail or draw distance or whatever you're doing, you'll do that because it's not that much more development work, particularly if you're going to release the game on the PC as well, where you're going to have like ultra high textures that maybe say up to 4K support. It's not that difficult to say, hey, the PS4 is in between the PC and the Xbox One, all we have to do is just slightly reduce the texture quality or slightly reduce the LOD. Now, with all of that said, I don't necessarily agree with all of his points. I totally appreciate what he's saying about the Xbox 360 versus PS3, I 100% agree. And I do agree that the PS4 does have a performance advantage, it just does. That's not me being biased, that's just how the systems are. The PlayStation 4's GPU is just higher performance. It has more asynchronous shaders. It can handle more compute queues. In terms of pure T-flop performance, the Xbox One is below the PS4. It's 1.31 versus 1.84. Admittedly, both systems do have overheads, but even if you count that, it's still not going to make the difference. The Xbox One CPU definitely has an advantage over the PlayStation 4's. It's running about 150 MHz faster, and the PS4 does have GDDR5 memory, which ESRAM is not as easy to use, and it does have problems. For example, high levels of AA. Development kit improvements have drastically improved the utilization of ESRAM, and they could do things, for example, like have a multiple frame buffers, that's the word I'm looking for, or even have different render targets or different textures rendering from certain things. For example, you can have maybe the skybox rendering from DDR3. All of that stuff definitely makes a considerable difference in the console. Plus, as well, now you've got better development tools overall, which allows you to see, for example, what's causing hiccups in the system, what's reducing the performance of the system. With all of that said, there are some problems with the analysis we've had at the moment, and that's we don't really know what's going on with the PlayStation 4. For example, we know that the Xbox One has had a couple of driver iterations on its GPU, and the second one, the one that we're using now, which name escapes me, but we have covered it in depth on the SDK breakdowns anyway, so if you want to go ahead and check those out, feel free. But we do know that the second driver revision they used for the GPU of the Xbox One considerably improved the performance. That's just, that's just a given. But we don't know what's gone on with the PlayStation 4 because, unfortunately, and I really wish it would, but it hasn't, the SDK has not leaked out. So, for example, although we know that the Xbox One and PS4 in terms of raw RAM amounts is roughly the same, as far as we understand it, both have about 5.5 gigabytes of memory available to games, it's possible that there has been some changes, even since the Xbox One's SDK has leaked out, and it's changed. For example, it could be now 6.5 gigabytes available for the Xbox One for games. I'm not saying it is, I'm just using the example. Same with the PS4. We don't know the reserved amount of GPU for the PS4 for the OS, for example, and that's kind of a problem. However, it's very unlikely that it's going to be significant enough to be able to impact it enough to be below that of the Xbox One. However, I think the big thing here isn't necessarily improvements in resolution, because ultimately it's like 720p, 900p, yes, the PlayStation 4 will look a little bit sharper, but honestly, at this point in time, no one's really... I think we're kind of arguing over like 720p or 900p or what have you, but reality, we're moving on to 4K, and this is why I was saying in another video that I think this generation of systems, I almost feel that Microsoft and Sony, but particularly Microsoft, kind of did some experimenting with this generation. Like the Xbox 360 generation, it lasted for too long. And I'm not saying that the systems were bad, I'm not saying that they weren't fun, but ultimately the hardware was getting really long in the tooth. Developers were complaining about it. Gamers kind of knew that there was nothing more they could do. And let's face it, the latest Gears of War, The Last of Us, they bloody pushed that thing. I mean, if you compare, for example, Uncharted 1 compared to Uncharted 3, and, I've been playing them because obviously I've been doing analysis and stuff for the PlayStation 4. Generally speaking, despite the fact that The Last of Us, Uncharted 1 has had improved geometry on the PS4 version, you can still tell that, damn, this is an early game compared to Uncharted 3. And it's not just that it has better geometry on Uncharted 3, you're just talking about everything about it. The engine just feels, I don't want to use the word less chunky, but it feels just better. And when you start looking at other games like, for example, Gears of War, I did some testing with a friend the other day before Gears of War, the remaster came out for the Xbox One. We were just kind of messing around with different versions of Gears of War, and I was looking at Gears of War 1, and I love the game. I really think like some of my favourite co-op experiences ever was when I was playing Xbox 360 Gears of War. But you compare that graphically compared to, let's say, Gears of War 3 even, or Judgment, you can see a massive disparity. And we're talking about shadows, lighting, textures, everything about it. It just looks considerably better. They managed to squeeze a lot out of the generation, but I think for this one it's going to be shorter, which I think is probably good. I think we're in this transitionary period at the moment with technology where no one really knows where VR or any of this stuff is going to go. So I'm going to close out by saying that I think that both systems at the moment have some really good benefits. I think that the PlayStation 4 needs to get its exclusive stuff sorted out. I think Microsoft are actually doing better with the exclusive. I'm not saying that they necessarily have better games in their lineup now, but I think that longer term, their exclusive plan might be slightly better. In other words, developing their own IPs. And it might necessarily not benefit the Xbox One now, or in a year, or maybe even 2 years. But it might benefit it in 2 years, or maybe 3 years, or maybe even Xbox's successor when they do have those IPs to fall back on. Another last point, I personally believe that you should play on whichever system you like. Now, I'm going to get some flack for this probably, but yes, occasionally I will notice differences going between the versions. This is particularly true if you're doing graphics comparisons and you're looking at them side by side or going through frames of animation. For example, doing frame rate comparisons in some games it's quite obvious. In other times it's less obvious. For example, Assassin's Creed Unity was basically, excuse the language, but it was fucked on the PlayStation 4. It really was. We got 17 frames a second out of it in one specific area, and it was actually better on the Xbox One. I'm going to assume the primary reason behind that is the Xbox One's CPU was slightly more robust, and because it was running at a lower resolution also, Unity was basically more playable on the Xbox One on launch, which is the conclusion we came to in our analysis. But generally speaking, I think that you should buy for the system that you enjoy, and ultimately, if you can buy both systems, then you're pretty set, to be honest with you. But if you're not, and you can only buy one system, I would say get the one that your friends are buying. Because honestly, that's probably going to be the thing. Or if you're a solo player, if you're not interested in Xbox Live or PlayStation Network, which, to be fair, is a pretty good, consistent thing. One could argue as well that it's actually even more tricky to make a decision if you're a PC owner. Because if you're a PC gamer, you might want to buy the PS4 because you might say to yourself, well, gee, some of the games on the Xbox One are going to come out on the PC, so it's better for me to buy the PS4. On the other hand, you might think the reverse and think to yourself, well, if I buy the Xbox One, I've then got that really great integration between the Xbox One and the PC, especially now we've got Windows 10. I think it's a really good time to be a gamer, to be honest with you. I genuinely do. And while I might grumble occasionally at some of the stuff that's happening within the industry, for example, microtransactions, that type of crap, I think the games that are out now are pretty damn good quality. And if you were to take a look at the release schedule over the next, let's say, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, let's say until February, March next year, I think you're going to be pretty damn happy. Anyway, that's my thoughts and opinions on it. You may disagree, and, well, that is entirely your prerogative. But with that said, I'm going to get going, so hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.